So I'm so excited to be introducing this author today. I met her last night, and I literally attacked her, and she can tell you that. I attacked her last night. I was so excited to meet her. And the subject is Mrs. Victorine Quill Adams. She's an icon of civil rights in the Baltimore area. I am a native son of Baltimore. I was born and raised in Baltimore, as one of my good friends here in the audience was raised in Baltimore. I'm one of 9 children. My father knew her husband. His name was Little Willie Adams. He, as you'll find out soon, was a numbers runner in Baltimore. I'm not going to tell you how my father knew him, but I guess you can figure out how my father knew him. But anyway, he turned an illegal business into a legitimate, thriving business, and he was able to support the endeavors of the community and his wife, Mrs. Adams. So I want to talk a little bit about her, and I'm not going to get too much into it because that's what our presenter will do. But she was elected the first woman. She was the first African-American female elected to the Baltimore City Council. And she and her husband helped elect other African-Americans to other local and state political offices. So one of the big things that she did was she started a fuel fund to help individuals who were having difficulty paying their fuel bills in the wintertime. And I mean, that is really something that was courageous, and I think it expanded. I think the state may have done it, but Dr. Jones will talk more about that. I'm not going to steal her thunder. I'm going to let her come up and give us all these great little tidbits. But I do want to tell you about Dr. Ida E. Jones, because she is fantastic. She's a native of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and if I get anything wrong, you just correct it, okay? You'll correct the record. I did my research, but you'll correct the record, okay? She came to Washington to attend Howard University, and she earned a degree in news editorial journalism and a PhD in American history. She has presented previously at the Gaithersburg Book Festival and has written books on William Henry Jernigan, Mary McLeod Bethune, and her first book is The Heart of the Race Problem, The Life of Kelly Miller. Dr. Jones is an archivist, and I think that is such an important endeavor to archive. I mean, because that is our written history, and that is her passion, and I hope she gets a chance to talk about that as well. She's an archivist at my alma mater, Morgan State University, and an adjunct professor in African American Studies Department at the University of Maryland College Park, along with the dissemination of various other historical and religious instructions that she gives to people. Her area of interest revolve around African American religion, women, and archives. In doing my research to prepare for my introduction, Dr. Jones was described as the consummate public scholar who seeks to inform the public about the gravity of history and historical studies, the gravity that history and historical studies have on everyday life. And I would like to go on regaling all of her accomplishments, but you don't want to hear me, you want to hear her. So I am going to take my seat. And without further ado, it is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome to the dais Dr. Ida E. Jones.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Brother Deacon Winborn. We had great conversation on last night, and he's AME Zion, and I'm Pentecostal, so we do get a little churchy. Victorine herself was actually Catholic, so this has a slightly ecumenical aspect to it. I want to thank the Gaithersburg City Council, especially Judd Ashman, whose innovative ideas brought this to pass, as well as the Book Planning Committee. All the people in pink for what they're doing, as well as the sponsors for what they're doing. We have to thank everybody, as well as you, the attendees, who make this what it is. So I wanted to come before you today to talk about my new work, Baltimore civil rights leader, Victorine Q. Adams. As we all know from reading the paper or watching the news, we know Baltimore is politically fraught right now in its city government. However, eliciting some mute chuckles. As all government is fraught, I suppose, both nationally, locally, regionally, maybe even organizationally. But the history of Baltimore that I've come to find out in particular has a very kind of prefabricated situation in which these things did not come out of just simple accident. There actually have been orchestrated efforts to basically undermine and elicit bad behavior from individuals. So what we're going to talk about today about Victorine was a period in which that was happening, but not as overtly as it was happening now in terms of our social media. How many people are familiar with the name Victorine Adams or William Adams at all? One person, great. This is good. Oh, two people, excellent. So I get to teach today. That's kind of exciting. And I have my spectacles. Now that I've gotten to be a certain age, I must wear my goggles. So what happens is that I am the archivist at Morgan State University. Oh, I gotta do it. I'm reading. Yes, Morgan State. And I came to Morgan in 2016. Morgan was celebrating its 150th anniversary, along with 8 other HBCUs. What I had not realized, having come from Howard University, which is the summum bonum of all HBCUs, to descend into the Valley of Morgan, was that there's such a rich history there. Morgan State was started in 1867 as a school for African American Methodist preachers. They were going to educate preachers for the ministry. By 1890, it turns into a liberal arts college, and by 1939, it turns into a state college. And in 1975, it becomes a university. A lot of this I hadn't known. And as a result of looking at the history of Maryland, Baltimore, and the African-American relationship with the state and the city, it's a very contested experience. We are in the South, and as a result, we're in North America, I guess in a larger sense, so there's a lot of racial antagonism that has happened. What Baltimore has that's very unique to itself is various ethnic enclaves as well as religious enclaves that really do play into one's identity. So even though you're living in the city of Baltimore, you're not really a resident of the entire city, depending upon if it's east side, west side, south side, north side, Protestant, Catholic. It's interesting. I have come to conclude that Baltimore is probably the most organic representation of America in terms of its kind of conflict of self and identity. So that's just my brief preface on all of that. So as I came to Morgan State, I arrived at the Beulah Davis Room, which is a special collection and archives location there on campus, which had been curated by a man named Dr. Roland McConnell since 1948. And so Dr. McConnell, himself a historian and archivist, had put things in order. So I didn't come to ultimate chaos as I thought I would, because there was no formal archivist hired. I came to order, I came to finding aids, and I came to collections that were in place. Victorine Adams dies in 2006 at the age of 93 years old, and she graduated from Morgan in 1940. She was very principled and very intentional on having her archives placed at her alma mater. And over the course of her 90-plus years, she collected everything. As you will see in the book, she has images of herself from the age of 5 months up until her 90s. She has organizational records that she started, organizations she belonged to, as well as a slew of photographs. Her husband actually did purchase property in Annapolis and opened a beach called Elktonia Beach. Because of segregation, African Americans could not sunbathe or attend beachfront experiences interracially. So he bought his own space and created his own beach. But what I saw with her in particular was how she, as an African American woman and a native Baltimorean, sought to assert her rights. So very briefly, in the preface, I'll explain to you how she viewed herself. On December 25th, 1971, in the Afro-American newspaper, Victorine writes, "I am the wife of Willie Adams, and his former status has been chronicled and presented for many years. For fear that some uninformed people may think I occupy my city council seat because, and only because, I am Willie's wife, I offer the following explanation. Whereas I'm well known as the wife of Willie Adams, I'm also better known in my community as a diligent, hardworking civic worker and civic leader in my own right. I want to remind some and inform others that I carved a niche in Baltimore for myself with my teaching techniques by sheer dint of my hard work. My husband's encouragement and financial support were not handicaps, but I did the purposing, the planning, and saw to the execution of many projects. I have paid my dues to Baltimore. I feel I should be regarded not only as the wife of Willie Adams, but as a woman who has used her influence and affluence to better the community in which she lives." So she made it very clear in 1971, almost around the age of 65 plus, to carve out a space for herself. And as those of us who study history in any sort, we know that married women of a certain generation were kind of subsumed under their husband and even losing their names. You were referred to as Mrs. John Smith or Mrs. Adam Smith. So as a result, she made sure that she was always going to be Victorine Quill Adams. She always kept her middle name in there in acknowledgement to her parents. So in looking at that quote and looking at her collection and understanding the history of Maryland and Baltimore, I said someone needs to tell her story. And this particular snapshot of her life is basically looking at the two clubs she organized. She was born in 1912 in Baltimore, Maryland, at Johns Hopkins University. She attends all of the colored schools because of segregation. She goes to what was then Coppin Normal School, where African American women were given their teaching certification. She then migrates to Baltimore's Morgan College at the time to get a BS in education. She's now a licensed teacher. She's teaching in the public school system, segregated public school system of Baltimore, between 1940 and about 1945. She founds with 4 other women the National Council of Negro Women Baltimore section in 1943. Now we know what's happening in the 1940s. It's World War II. Mrs. Bethune, who I wrote about earlier, did a great effort at crusading for African Americans in general and women in particular with wartime employment. So she's hearing all of this. She's now in her 20s, and she's very energized with the idea of what's possible for African American people. So in 1946, she founds an organization called the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee. And the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee, and I was asked by Ms. Cass on WYPR, why was she Democratic? I mean, most African Americans are Republican. She was not being Democratic in terms of party affiliation, but in the overarching ideal of what democracy represents in this country. She was actually a registered Republican, and she does switch parties, much to her mother's displeasure because of the idea of what the Democratic Party meant. But what she did with the CWDC was to create a space for African American women, principally educators. A lot of Baltimore's history in civil rights are by teachers and social workers as well as lawyers. But you really see public school teachers really galvanizing and crusading for civil rights. Another story, possibly another book. But nevertheless, the idea of opening this club was to teach about voter education, to understand that we have the franchise for women as of 1920, which we'll be celebrating the centennial on next year, and for African American men since the 1870s. So Baltimore at one time had over 1 million residents living in the city, the majority of which were African Americans. So they could actually sway an election if they were organized and informed. So she was going to use the same didactic instructions from her classroom in the public setting. So every place, beauty salons, street corners, churches, would be a place of education. During that same window of time, her husband purchases for her a place called the Charm Center. It's going to be an African American boutique. Once again, because of segregation in Jim Crow, African American women of means could not shop in certain department stores. So they'd go to Philadelphia or New York to be able to buy clothing with dignity. After you went into other stores, as soon as you touched it, it was yours. You could not try anything on because you stained it with your presence. So she opens the Charm Center, and I've met some women who went in there as young adults and children and said it was amazing. You almost had to be invited in. And the carpet was so plush, it's like you just sank. And so they said it was a very posh place for African Americans in Baltimore. So out of this Charm Center, which her husband purchased but she managed, she holds meetings for her organization. She even buys a voting machine and explains to him what the mechanics of engaging the machine is. We still have the machine in the collection. I didn't put a picture in the book, I should have, my fault. But nevertheless, she's teaching about voting. She's looking at the idea of educating about voting. Politics is not about election day. It's 365 days of consciousness about conversation, ideas, and things that are going to percolate till they get to the ballot. So a lot of things can be kind of edited out or stopped at the birth before it's fully born. So that's what she wanted to have, voter education for women, because we know the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. So as a result, that was the intention. And she was also trying to get African American men who might have been somewhat passive about voting to be more engaged about voting, to understand their authority in the ballot box. They actually crusade and get a man named Harry Cole, another Morgan graduate, the first African American elected in the state of Maryland. I believe it was to the, not the city council, it might have been to the state senate at that time. Thank you, state senate. Catch me up on what I did. And so he actually becomes a judge too. He ran on the Republican ticket also, and as a result, they supported him. Not just with getting the consciousness out about his vote, but the money to support his campaign. So Morgan State University really becomes this nexus of where political activism and education in the classroom, at the ballot box, in the city, at the State House, really kind of become this swirling eddy of power and shift. A lot of the civil rights activity in the state of Maryland that we're now experiencing is really due in part to African American students, teachers, and faculty and alum of Morgan State University. And I'm working on trying to really explore that a little deeper and really have us understand why the HBCU presence in the state of Maryland is extremely crucial for the fledgling aspects of education. But back to Victorine. So now we close the 1940s, and she has her organization, she has the Charm Center. What she's going to do by 1958 is start an organization called Woman Power. So Woman Power is going to be much larger than the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee. They're going to have chapters in other states, and they're going to move from educating to basically identifying women to run for political office. So as a result, this is going to be an interracial, multi-state effort to identify women, proto-Emily's list, to run for office regardless of party. They made it very clear, it's not about party, it's about the platform. Does the platform of this candidate support our community's needs? So she's really teaching about voting and the power of organized numbers. Not just flash mobs, as much as we might like those and kind of do with the clothesline dance or whatever they're doing, but to really understand numbers have power, and politicians respect numbers because they have influence at the ballot box. So the Woman Power, Inc. holds its first meeting at the Belvedere Sheraton Hotel, the Sheraton Belvedere Hotel in Baltimore. That event is believed to be the first integrated event in the city of Baltimore held at a large scale. And it's very interesting because what they do in that particular space is they're now declaring that because we have Brown has passed, we've passed legislation with integrating the military, the world is shifting. And Baltimore cannot become an arcane space. They'll become irrelevant. So as a result, people are going to be moving out of spaces that were prescribed for them into spaces that they're going to self-define. So she and this woman named Ethel P. Rich, who was a social worker, innovated this and educated a number of women and also identified women candidates. The first benefactor of that was Verda Welcome. Verda Freeman Welcome, another Morgan State graduate, becomes the first African-American woman in the country to become a state senator. And she's elected around 1962. So once again, you see them using their contacts and using this idea of this community in Baltimore, almost to the benefit of segregation, to be able to identify individuals they could support. So I go a little further into this here, and I wanted to read another quote for you in terms of setting it up so you can understand the mindset. So Victorine Adams was conceived at a time of tangled and blurry lines in Maryland and across America. The rise of domestic terrorism left mangled bodies swaying from the trees of the South. These gruesome spectacles were hoisted high to warn, threaten, and proclaim the Republic as a white man's country. Moreover, the political gains of the Reconstruction era melted away through the scalding white-hot heat of virulent racism and open violence towards African-American politicians and citizens. So she is going to be born that year, 47 years after the end of chattel slavery and 16 years after Plessy versus Ferguson. So she's born in a very pivotal time in American history, and especially African-American history. And I was talking with one interview person, and I had mentioned that I have a chapter here about respectability. So she's like, what do you mean by respectability? I don't understand what that means. I was trying to explain to her African-American women in particular, after enslavement, sought to redefine themselves in terms of self-definition. Enslavement placated them and put them in a position of servile, sexually degenerate positions that were not self-defined but superimposed. So respectability becomes this way in which they now choose to self-define and represent themselves accordingly. The book has over 64 pictures in it, and believe me, there are thousands of pictures in the collection. But the way in which she comported herself and the way in which she adorned herself was very important. And she actually has a discussion here when she goes to the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee, instructing the women on how to dress when they were attending these meetings. So I will read this for you, and you can kind of get an idea of what this time period looked like. Do not overdress. Be neat. Wear a hat and gloves, no slips showing. Please, no loud talking. Be alert at all times. Speak clearly if called upon. Give your name and title. Make sure to mention Miss or Mrs., registered voter, and interested in good government. Take a friend with you if you can. The more, the merrier. However, only the delegate or alternate will be paid. If you cannot go at the appointed time, let us know, or better still, get a substitute, a lady in the club. She even goes further to tell the women, don't take notes in the meeting, because if people see you taking notes in a political meeting, they might alter their conversation or edit things out. So she was very strategic in doing all of this. I just want to mention just briefly too, and open the floor for questions, her husband. So there's an interesting thing about her husband. We know that most ethnic communities in this country, as they came into this country to become American citizens, were locked out of mainstream American economic and social institutions. So they created alternative spaces for themselves, from churches to grocery stores, as well as economic income. So Willie Adams, a North Carolina migrant to Baltimore during the early 20th century, went into the numbers business, like almost every other ethnic group or marginalized community in Baltimore. What Willie Adams did with his numbers running, as we can call it, was innovate ways in which to do it differently. So he's going to use a bicycle to move out of certain areas because he couldn't take someone's territory because that could lead to physical violence. So he's going to go to other spaces with a bicycle and capture the other pools of money that are available. He's going to keep all these numbers in his head. So if he's stopped by the police, he has no chits or what they little teeny sheets on. He has no paper on him. My uncle, I was telling him about this, and he said, I was about 6, and someone told me, take this across the street. It was like a weekly thing. So Uncle Ralph would just take it. And when my grandfather found out, don't you take that paper anymore? Don't you talk to that? He was only 6, and he was the adult said, take it across the street. So he took the paper across the street. So my uncle was a numbers runner, I suppose. Sorry, Uncle Ralph. But we're past that. He's in his 80s now, so I think the statute of limitations is passed. But nevertheless, so once again, everyone was benefiting from this idea of this underground economy. Unfortunately, it does get demonized by organized crime, where it moves from simply money making into money laundering, into human trafficking, into drugs. Adams was very clear. It was always about money, to the point where they died worth millions. There's still a scholarship in their name that they still give. And I would love to meet Mr. Cheshire, who wrote a book called They Call Me Little Willie, that talks about Willie Adams and this money he made because he had no paper. Yet Henry Park Sausages, anyone knows Park Sausages? Here, he funded that with $83,000 in cash because that was the collateral. Most African Americans didn't have property or any kind of material wealth. So Willie understood, people understand cash. So if you give me this money, I can back it up because here's the money. So it was always about cash. I just met the men from the Nation of Islam in Baltimore. The property that they now occupy, Willie Adams sold that to him. He also owned a thing called ground rent. In Baltimore, they can own the land your house is on. So there's a thing called ground rent. I'm learning so much. I feel like I'm having a whole entire new education in Baltimore. So Willie Adams owned a lot of ground rent. So even though he didn't own the physical property, he still was getting paid something. He opened coffee shops and clubs and radio stations. He funded pretty much any endeavor whatsoever. And the interesting thing about him is that there was a wiretap sometime in the late 70s or the early 80s in which he could have possibly had gone to prison. But he was very, once again, shrewd in understanding that someone's listening, so I might not want to say that too explicitly what I'm doing. The other person who was a relative was a little too explicit, and he actually went to jail. So Willie himself had been indicted both in the state and the federal areas, but he never went to jail. Others did around him. Doesn't that sound familiar in our political environment? At any rate, you have to admire them, whether you respect them or not. Those individuals who are either slick enough or smart enough to avoid that is pretty impressive. But what happens in 1970 or 73, when Maryland now wants to open its lottery, who do you think they hired to run the lottery system? Willie Adams. And he uses his system to benefit the state of Maryland. So if you scratch, itch, pull, whatever you do, it's in tribute to Willie Adams posthumously because he understood the idea of the economy. Just back to Victorine real quickly, her parents weren't in unity about her dating him. Her father was very leery, but her mother played the numbers with him and thought he was amazing. How much better could it be? He's one of us now. So eventually the father does concede, and he ends up working for little Willie as well as her brother. So just in closing, I think it's a very interesting portrait of a life in Baltimore, of a principled life in Baltimore. Like I said, she was Catholic, and there was a documentary done in 2001 where they're being interviewed, and he said, yeah, she's always in Mass, always in church, always. He himself was non-affiliate. And so as a result, I think she kept herself clean enough and integrity enough to kind of sanitize him a bit. But she never openly exploited his wealth. She had her own income, her own vision, and her own self-definition. So I thank you for your time. I'd love to have some questions from you, and thank you for coming this morning. Yes. I did not have a chance to meet her yet. We were both on the planet at the same time, but I never had a chance to meet her. But in her collection, her archival collection, I processed that collection. And in processing the collection, I got to touch every item that she saved. So from the photographs to the letters to the other kinds, the artifact, that machine I mentioned, really told me about her, but I had to marry that with reading other things, books and newspaper articles about her in particular. And the Afro-American newspaper was the most informative because they captured everything about the two of them in terms of that. So learning about her from her principal material called the archival collection, and then the secondary material in the newspapers and the books. Yes, exactly. Yes. Yes, they are. Thank you for asking. Okay, sales pitch for archives. Yes, okay. Most universities have archives. Most states have archives, and cities have archives. Most of us are public because the whole idea is to share the information. We at Morgan State are open to the public. Any adult over the age of 18 is welcome to come. We encourage History Day for our young people too with an adult, and we have things called finding aids or pathfinders that explain to you who the organization or the individual was and what items are in that collection. You're at liberty to use your phone or to have us copy material for you to use with proper citation. You must cite. So yes, that's what we do. And so as a result, we encourage everyone to take a look at your state, city archives, public libraries, schools. We're not as populous as libraries, but we do in archives have a point, our toe in the pond. Yes. Oh yes, thank you so much. Yes, so in terms of her work publicly, the Baltimore Fuel Fund was in a public-private partnership that Victorine instituted in the 1970s. Seemingly prior to the kind of laws we have now, people who had any kind of debt on their fuel bill, BG&E would cut it. They would just turn your heat off. So in the winter of 78 or 1977, there were several fires that killed people because they could not afford to pay their fuel bill. So they were using alternative sources to heat their housing. And there were 4 deaths that were remarkably documented in Baltimore because of a debt of between $500 and $1,000. So she thought that was just an egregious thing to turn off the heat in the middle of the winter. So she, along with the government, started a public-private partnership to raise money to help accommodate those individuals who might be in need of having some assistance from the city. So once again, Willie's money was definitely involved in that on some level, as well as campaigns where she raised money to help the private side meet the public side in helping people who are residents in Baltimore. Oh yes, I will. I'll get that to, I see somebody else, yes. You had a question too? That's a very good question. That's my dear friend Jane Levy from the DC Historical Studies Conference many moons. And we think we're better in DC, and of course we are. But I don't know. I don't know if it's better. I'm learning to find another term to identify there. But yes, there was intersection between her and DC through the NCNW. The National Council of Negro Women is a national organization, now an international organization, started by Mary McLeod Bethune, who herself was an educator. She was very affinited and very connected to Mrs. Bethune, and she served as a secretary for the Baltimore section. So there's tons of letters going back and forth between 1940 and 1943 between her and Mrs. Bethune. And I definitely know with the meetings they had in Washington, D.C., I see pictures of the Baltimore section meeting in D.C. It must have been the Department of the Interior, one of those grandeurs, luxury buildings that are in the government. So I know there was lots of conversation and intersection there. And actually there was another woman, Kate Shepard, who was another educator, a Morgan graduate as well, who was a friend of Bethune's and a contemporaries. And I know she would have definitely helped bring that conversation to Baltimore. So I'm seeing threads slowly rise to the top. The other question was about William Donald Schaefer. William Donald Schaefer was the mayor and actually on the city council of Baltimore. And I have to kind of disclaim this with speculation that I had learned that they got along very well. Outgoing city councilwoman Mary Pat Clark in Baltimore, when she was speaking with me, mentioned that he would refer to her and Barbie Mikulski as city council girls. But he never referred to Victorine as such. And so they must have been probably in their 30s at the time, but he was very clear on kind of demeaning them in terms of who they were, but never Victorine. Now, Victorine was a very petite woman, probably about 5 feet tall and probably never over 100 pounds. And so Mary Platt Clark has a very similar physical size to her, but she said, I really believe, and as I've been told by another individual who will remain nameless, that it was her husband's presence and his roots in the city that made Donald kowtow to Victorine. As a result, because he could be somewhat of a bully, I've been told. And as a result, even with the Inner Harbor development and the kind of displacement of individuals that made the Inner Harbor what it was, Victorine had some issues with that and other things. Eventually, he does win the day in some of his engagements, but he did not simply bulldoze her or snowplow, as the new term is. He did kowtow because of Willie Adams. So it's interesting that her husband, who doesn't remain vocal, he has no paper, there are no records, I have not seen them, even love letters, there's nothing of him but pictures in her collection. So I literally think he left the world paperless. But he had a very imposing, almost like a shadow, it just grows larger than the physical, and he's back there. And she acknowledges that, but she never really brings it to bear. But he was clearly evident with the Donald Schaefer relationship in Baltimore at the time. Are there any other questions? Oh, yes.
Thanks. Did she have children? Have they carried on her legacy?
There was one non-viable birth. There was one pregnancy, but not a viable birth. Yeah. 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 All righty, I want to thank you for your rapt attention and let you move on. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for attending the 10th Annual Gaithersburg Book Festival. Ida will be available for signing in, well, it's a little more than 10 minutes because this was supposed to go to 11:05. So, yeah, we're real early. Do you have more you want to say? Yeah, come back up. You have so much more time.
Well, I didn't want to keep everybody too long, but yeah, the books are at Politics and Prose. Yeah, you can if you want. There's a signing down a little further. There's
a tennis courts right behind us. 10A, line 5.
Thank you. You moved it. Wow. Okay.
I'm sorry. I think 45 minutes. So that should start around 11:10 or 11:15 and probably go till about noon, the signing. But
thank you very much.
Yes.
Okay, yes. So just, that's a good point. So I forgot to mention too that she was elected to the state senate in 1966. She had ran one time in the early 60s and lost that campaign, but she runs again in 1966 and is elected to the state senate. But in 1967, she runs for the city council. She leaves her senate seat and goes to the city council, and there was questions about that, and she decided to leave to go to the city because there was no voice in the city for the working poor. So she understood, and this is even before 1968 and all what's going to happen. She sees Kennedy getting killed, so there's lots of that as a Catholic and as a human being, seeing a president murdered or assassinated, excuse me. So the idea is that she has all of this about Kennedy. You can see the volatile nature of what's happening in the city. You can see what's happening in the country and the world for that matter. So she decides to come back to Baltimore City and remains there for 5 terms as a city councilwoman. During the course of her tenure, the whole idea of the working class poor was a very urgent need for her to focus on, because what happened in Baltimore, McCormick Spice and a lot of the manufacturing and shipping businesses had started to leave, and individuals who had worked there for generations of their families now did not have the skill set to find employment in other places. So they were criminalizing poor people, because if they did something that was considered underground, whether it be selling stolen items or whatever things they did to maintain income, they did not have the skill set to have legitimate employment. So she was really advocating and crusading for the idea of training. The same money you're using to lock people up can be used for job training, to be able to empower people to find the employment they need to do what they need to do. Then she said, well, to go to the school system. If they have a better education, then they could find a better job and therefore be more valuable to society. So what we see with her election in 1967 is this real kind of struggle and tussle that I think really kind of ends with Kurt Schmoke, with the idea of facing the realities of what future employment is going to look like, and the need to really address how do we train children, how do we educate, how do we basically inculcate citizenship and the idea of self-maintenance to people who maybe are looking for other ways to maintain themselves. So she was really seeking to crusade for that, and I just found a cache of items that are not in the physical collection because they were in unmarked boxes in the archives. So there are tons of letters from her constituents. I just left the military. I used to work at so-and-so. Can you help me find a job? Here's my resume. Can you help me with this? So she was answering all these questions from her constituency who were seeking to say, well, you're my elected representation. Can you help me? And so she was looking at creating job training. So in the foreword by Larry Gibson, of University of Maryland Law School, he interviewed her for like several hours, her and the husband, because they were basically one. And I guess she was talking and he would be over her shoulder once again, off camera. No, that's this, that's this. So Professor Gibson has promised me those tapes. I have yet to see them, but I know he's busy. But nevertheless, he's talking from behind her. And so he said, what's your biggest accomplishment? She didn't mention the fuel fund, ironically enough. She mentioned the social service building in Baltimore City. She had that location changed to another area, I think it's in West Baltimore, to have that constructed, because that meant jobs. Someone has to build it, someone has to staff it. So the idea of bringing jobs into the city for thousands of people was what she sought to do during that time. And of course, there's no mention of that in the collection, because I would have talked about it. But what blew me away was the fuel fund. So I have to thank Professor Gibson for bringing that to my attention. So if there's ever to be a 2.0 for this, or a further conversation about her and city government in Baltimore, which is very fascinating, because it's not always race-based, as we see in the media. It's really class-based. But they paint a black face on this as a result of the poverty, the drugs, the crime, when it's really a class issue that's probably compounded by religion and geography. The whole west side, east side thing. I'm still learning the geography of that particular city, and it goes back generations, because you're dealing with people who've been there 4, 5, 6, 7 generations. So it's not the transient cities like Washington, D.C. and other places. So as a result, it's a lot of nuances to Baltimore City, but I think she says the Social Security building and that employment, and people do have letters in the new part of the collection talking about that. So there's so much more to learn about her. I encourage everyone, if you don't buy it, to check it out from the library, because it really helps you understand how Baltimore evolved into what we're seeing right now. And a lot of what we're seeing is not the real root of what's happening. We're seeing a lot of kind of sizzle, but the steak is much, much different. If it's steak at all, maybe it's turkey chops, I don't know. But nevertheless, that'll be the last tidbit I'd like to add. So once again, thank you so very much again.